Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Indie Artist Studio. I'm Elena Gross, the Director of Exhibitions and Curatorial Affairs at MOAD, and it's my pleasure today to be speaking and touring in virtual space with artist Shimon Attie. Before we get to the conversation, just a few housekeeping items, as I mentioned to earlier, but as people come into Zoom, if you wouldn't mind dropping in the chat where you're joining us from. MOAD's physical building may be closed due to the mandatory shelter in place, but you can still get your fill of art and artists of the African diaspora or whose work engages with the African diaspora. Each Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific, join myself or my colleague Dimitri Broxton as we visit some of our favorite artists in their studios to see what they're currently working on and how their work is changing as a result of the quarantine. This is a rare opportunity to hear from artists directly from their studios. We will follow all talks with an audience Q&A, so please feel free at any point throughout the talk today to drop your questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box. If you're joining us on Facebook, feel free to leave your comments there as well. They'll be migrated over to Zoom, and we'll get to those in a little bit. And please visit our website to see which artists we have coming up. You can also go back and watch all of our previous talks on the MOAD YouTube channel. MOAD stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Daunte Wright, Tony McDade, and Ma'Khia Bryant. We mourn all who have lost their lives at the hands of police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we do not know. We want to acknowledge that MOAD's commitment to racial justice is ongoing, and as such, we will continue to say their names and to hold space and honor these victims. We'd also like to give a land acknowledgement. Most of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples whose land we are located. With deep respect, MOAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, our people, our work, and our network servers are on native lands, and we thank the indigenous people of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Lastly, if you've been enjoying this series or any of MOAD's programming, please consider donating to MOAD online. Donations of any amount are always welcome. There will be a link in the chat where you can donate. I also meant to, this series was made possible by generous donations from the Westridge Foundation and California Humanities, our wonderful MOAD members and viewers like you. Thank you for your continued support. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's artist, Shimon Attie. Shimon is a visual artist whose practice includes creating permanent and temporary site-specific installations in public places, immersive mixed media installations for museums and galleries, art photographs, and new media works. In many of his projects, Attie has used a variety of media to animate sites with images of their lost histories or speculative futures. This has included introducing the histories and narratives of marginalized and/or forgotten communities into the physical landscape of the present. In other often video works, Attie engages local communities in finding new ways of representing their history, memory, and potential futures. Whether working with public sites or in museums and galleries, Attie's work explores how contemporary media may be used to reimagine new relationships between space, time, place, and identity. Shimon Attie's work has been exhibited and collected by numerous museums around the world, including by New York's Museum of Modern Art, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the ICA in Boston, and the Miami Art Museum, among many others. In addition, he has received numerous visual artist fellowships and awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Rome Prize, artist grants from the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and a visual artist fellowship from Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute and from the National Endowment for the Arts, among many others. 5 monographs have been published on Attie's work, which has also been the subject of a number of films that have aired on PBS, BBC, and ARD. Since receiving his MFA degree in 1991, he has realized approximately 30 major projects in 10 countries around the world. In 2019, Attie was awarded the Lee Krasner Achievement Award, and in 2018 was inducted as a national academician into the National Academy of Design. Finally, in 2020, Shimon Attie was appointed as the inaugural Charles C. Bergman Endowed Visiting Professor of Studio Art at Stony Brook University and as the Horger Artist in Residence at Lehigh University. Welcome, Shimon.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. And
there was
a lot of words in there.
Quite an accomplishment. Many accomplishments.
Yeah, sounds like an old guy, actually, but we never like to date ourselves. Anyway, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for spending part of your afternoon with us and with me. I'm speaking to you from New York, where it's over 90 degrees outside Fahrenheit today, so it's a bit warm. So without further ado, I thought, because I don't know how familiar you are with my work, I thought I would give a very short sort of little highlights, maybe 15, maximum 20 minutes in length, because that will inform the conversation we're going to have afterwards. Okay, so that said, let me do screen share. Optimize for video, share sound, yes. As Elena said, I've probably realized 30 or 35 projects. At some point I stopped counting. I'm not going to show that much video today because video doesn't play that well via Zoom, sharing via Zoom. But let me just show you a little bit of my work. And the whole frame of diaspora is something that I think goes to the core of who I am as an artist from the very beginning. Many of my projects focus on a search for home, roots, belonging, working with issues related to displacement, dispossession, marginalization, and sort of intersectional layered identities. One of my first projects after art school, this is the project that many of you may know. This is, by the way, I got my MFA at San Francisco State. But in any case, this is from the Writing on the Wall, which is a project I did in one of Berlin's former Jewish quarters. And what you're looking at is it's not Photoshop, it's not collage, it's not photo montage. I'm literally across the street from this building with my video, well, actually they were not video projectors, they were Kodak carousel slide projectors, slide projecting an image of a Hebrew bookstore taken in 1930 at this exact address, slide projecting it back onto the building's facade, and then taking a color photograph of the black and white projection from the past, interacting with the architecture of today, meaning of the early 90s. So these are photographs of Jewish street life from about 1920 till 1932. I deliberately stopped right before the Nazis took power, as we know what happened later to most of the residents of this community. So from the very beginning of my artistic life, there was a sense of giving voice to communities that have disappeared, been erased, and lost, but that somehow are still resonant in the architecture and the cityscape of today. And I'm just moving quite quickly. I'm just sharing a little bit of Portraits of Exile with you because it prefigures Night Watch, which was sort of the impetus for my presentation with you today, and the invitation from MOAD, because Night Watch is going to be coming to the San Francisco Bay, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But Portraits of Exile was an early piece of mine that dealt with the topic of refugees and waterways as a medium for escape, safe passage, rescue, and also memory. These are not projections, these are underwater light boxes. And this was before LED technology was developed. So these were they each weighed 1,000 pounds. And they're portraits. There were 9 light boxes, half of them were present day refugees. This was in Copenhagen. And they were living in Denmark in the 90s, who were not given a very heroic welcoming or helping hand. They were met with quite a lot of ambivalence. It's even worse today, much more xenophobia in Denmark even than there was in the mid-90s when I did this project. This is a woman, a refugee from the former Yugoslavia, with a entry stamp on her passport limiting her residence allowance in Denmark. The other light boxes were of Danish Jews that were rescued to Sweden during the Second World War on fishing boats over about a 10-night period. right before they would have been deported to death camps. So I was interweaving these two human rights stories, one sort of heroic, larger than life, altruistic, the rescue of 10,000 Danish Jews to Sweden. This is another Danish Jew with one of the boats that was used in the rescue in 1943. But in any case, a sort of heroic historical tale of human rights and social justice butting up against a much more wanting and ambivalent present day tale. The one bridge between them being water, which is why I did an underwater installation. It was up for 2 months. The audience was sort of to the right here. Here you see all 9 light boxes, and the Danish Parliament building was right behind there. So it was very central. But that's an early project where I was already working with the water and refugees and asylees. I just wanted to show a couple of pieces from my Rome project, which I don't usually share when I give public presentations, only because you can't do everything. But for me, this project really speaks about diaspora, longing, looking for home. And in the case of my Rome project, these are projections, they're site-specific projections of individuals onto present day and ancient Rome. And I was trying to raise questions of who's on the inside of this grand history of the West and who's on the outside, who's included, who's excluded. And if we had more time, I would discuss this more deeply. And facts on the ground, a project I did in Israel and Palestine. I'm one person who, I've probably lived in too many countries for my own good. Maybe six countries I think I've lived in, including Israel from my teenage years and some periods since then. And I did a project this is not that long ago, this is 2014, site-specific light boxes that I created, conceived, and crafted in response to specific locations that were contested, in terms of the seam lines between Israelis and Palestinians. This is called Landlord. And of course, there's a generator that you don't see that's off frame. And we're at the edge of a Palestinian village, Tuba, that was annexed by Israel after the 6-Day War. And we're looking onto Har Homa, what most of the world would say is an illegal settlement, Israeli settlement. What some Israelis might say is a new neighborhood of East Jerusalem. Unlike Euphoria, this is Tel Aviv. This is the site where the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated for trying to make peace with the Palestinians in the form of the Oslo Peace Accords. All of one's fears. Here we are in Tel Aviv. The building on the left with the orange light is actually the ruins of a mosque, basically an archaeology site. The 2 Stars of David on the right is a synagogue. That's what synagogues look like in that neighborhood. And then my intervention, all of one's fears, sort of triangulating the viewer in this. And I was sort of trying to reflect how projective identification works. I mirror back to you your worst fear of who I am, and then you mirror back to me my worst fear of who you are. And then it's sort of a race to the bottom. A problem in logic. This is the Israel-Palestine separation wall. And now this brings us closer to home. Night Watch, as I say, coming to San Francisco Bay in just a few short weeks on September 17th, 18th, and 19th. I'm sure someone's going to drop that into the chat. Together with a survey exhibition of my work that's opening with Catherine Clark Gallery on September 18th. And just to show you a little bit of the New York version, and you have to kind of translate it in your mind and substitute the Golden Gate Bridge for, the Statue of Liberty. But hold on just a second. Let's just see what's going on here. And I might just let this play because it combines. Night Watch was a floating media installation that traveled in the waterways around New York City during the fall of 2018, featuring a 20-foot high-resolution LED screen aboard a slow-moving barge and tugboat. Night Watch displayed silent close-up video portraits of 12 up, can't read fast enough, 12 new New Yorkers, people whose lives were saved by being granted political asylum by the US government, even during the time of Trump. Most of them are from the international LGBTQI community. Some of them were unaccompanied minors or children at the border. And in New York, Night Watch circulated for 8 consecutive nights during UN General Assembly Week. It's the 8-minute, on the screen is a, I think it's 8 minutes, I think that's about, or was it 9 minutes? Anyway, 8 or 9 minute film of silent video portraits, 12 individuals. They approach the camera from the distance. They look at the viewers on the shoreline with fairly restrained expressions. They don't reveal their interiority by design, and we're left to struggle with what do they feel, what is their experience. Each of them have horrific tales of survival. I mean, many of them are young and beautiful, but it's very misleading. When they start sharing their experiences, they're very harrowing. And almost all of them less than alive. She was a judge in Russia that uncovered a corruption scheme, and they told her that if she didn't flee the country, they were going to kill her and her daughter. There she is, watching that question herself. Now, the film itself, the 9-minute Night Watch film, it begins with a quote by James Baldwin: "We contain the other hopelessly and forever." And I'm just going to show you just 1 or 2 minutes of it so you can get a better sense of the texture, the aesthetic texture of the portraits and the way we filmed them. And the 12 individuals came from 5 continents, Africa, South America, Europe. Also, there were several from the Caribbean and East Asia. And I just have them look. I wanted to create kind of a I-thou encounter. And we think we know what refugees feel. We have all kinds of projections onto them, or asylees. And I wanted to interrupt that process. And that's why I encourage them that they have the right to remaining opaque to us. They have a right to opacity. She was an unaccompanied minor at the border when she was apprehended. And that was just 2 of the 12. I believe it was 12. And then it ends with a dedication for the millions who've been forced to flee their homelands to escape violence and discrimination, for the fortunate few who've been granted political asylum in the United States. 12 of these individuals appear in this piece. And just a few still photographs, some of which I think will be included in the gallery exhibition. The end. We made it. I'm going to stop the share. Cool, here we are again. So, full screen, Elena, I'm all yours.
Excellent. So that was fantastic. I'm glad we were able to get a snippet of your very expansive project before jumping into the conversation. A couple of those projects I had been familiar with, but then the one with in Rome specifically I hadn't seen before, so that was really exciting to be able to kind of witness, and very exciting to think about what Night Watch can look like in the San Francisco Bay. So just to kick things off, because this was a project, this series in the Artist Studio is a series that was kind of originally began as a means of connecting with artists and finding out a little bit about them and their practices over this time of separation, over this time of the pandemic. And so my first questions to artists are always specific to, where are you right now, and whether or not you can tell us a little bit about your studio and how your studio practice has maybe shifted due to the pandemic over this last year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm in New York, which is where I live. I'm in the East Village, to get very specific. The first thing, one of the first things that happened when the pandemic hit is the entire building where my studio is, the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, which has 90 artist studios, it shut down for months.
Wow.
So 90 artists, unless you broke the mayor's order and snuck in there, 90 artists, including myself, lost their access to their studios. I knew we were going to discuss this, and it's a little bit complicated for me because I don't have a traditional studio practice, meaning a lot of my pieces are kind of nomadic. I respond to locations and sites, and I travel to do projects. And I'm about to begin a brand new project in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, as an artist in residence, as artists in residence at Lehigh University, and they're giving me a physical studio there. I have a live work space at home, and so I do have some room here to spread out a bit. But the other thing is, and this is more like kind of philosophical, also a bit personal, but I like having time, and I like making art, and I like not making art. And the pandemic sort of forced a time for reflection, reflection. And like I remember in 2008 when there was the financial crisis and all of my projects were canceled. Like for years I had maybe for the next 3 or 4 years, everything was just canceled. And then it's a similar process this time where it's an opportunity where you're really kind of forced to reflect on what's most urgent and what's most important. Rather than just sort of being in production mode, do. I was more like that when I was a younger artist, I think. So I value the time and reflection that I've had. I also find it, and I think all of us on some level have found it to be kind of a singular sort of challenge. This has been a very strange experience. And how malleable can each of us be in terms of coping with this? So anyway, that's sort of my response. It's been kind of a mixed situation because partly I don't only work in the studio. I also have a lot of collaborators. So like my video editor and sound designer, we can work remote, we've been able to work remotely. And so some of it has continued as well.
Yeah, that was obviously something that I was thinking about a lot in terms of your practice being so site specific, and with travel restrictions in place and with social distancing in place, with the work being so collaborative as well, it necessarily would have to change certain aspects of the way that you work. So would you say that, you're saying that, this time gave you a lot of time to reflect, but I guess that's also, that brings me into, a more, another question about your work in general, which is just like how heavy in terms of research that has to be necessary for you to engage with specific locations that have specific rich and complex and dynamic histories and cultures and identities, and how that is often always shifting. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the research process looks like for you in developing these projects, and how long do you normally spend, really unpacking some of those histories before you even begin the installations or begin the activations on site?
Right. No, it's a very good question. And I want to just mention something very specific also, which is that apropos what you were saying earlier, my artist in residence engagement in Bethlehem was delayed. We put it back a year precisely because my work is so much of it is based on community engagement. And because of the pandemic, that was like impossible. So right. We delayed it until now. But getting to the heart of your question, well, that's a huge part of my practice, is taking at least 6 months and just reading and doing site visits and immersing myself in a history, in a people, in a context. And then if I'm lucky, after a few months, I will start to, an idea will emerge. And it's always very tentative. And I usually check it out with local people who might be participating in a potential project. I ask them what they think of the idea. Fortunately, usually they've liked the idea, but and sometimes they're crazy ideas. I mean, really crazy. But that's a very big part of I do an immense amount of research, and I would say minimum for me to develop a concept, at least 6 months.
Yeah.
More than that, and it feels kind of, it's stressful, and it feels a little more superficial.
I'm glad that you said that, because I think obviously there's a way. 6 months seems like it would have to be the minimum in terms of, not only, the reading and the learning, but also you're forming these connections with the communities who are on the ground that you're working with, and being able to kind of develop relationships and develop that trust as a person, coming into a space that is maybe not your own, as an outsider of sorts. What kind of practice, can you speak to how you were able to how you're able to navigate and build trust, especially with communities of color, where that have these legacies of, there can be hesitation, there can be resistance there to an outsider kind of coming in and working with their culture. So I'm just wondering, how do you navigate and how do you develop trust across the communities that you engage?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I'm thinking of Di Williams and his wife, who were in the audience, because he was the producer for my Welsh project, which was with a village that lost most of its children in a man-made avalanche. And I was most definitely an outsider. And this is a very, very complex terrain, especially when you're working with communities that have been traumatized or marginalized. And I think where I come from is I think I have my own it becomes very personal very quickly, unfortunately. But I have personal connections to the subject matter in every project. And sometimes the community, sometimes not the specific community. And building, the way that I build trust, I'm just honest and sincere. I present my past work, and I speak about what I hope a project will achieve. And I do a whole lot of listening. And I try not to take up a lot of space.
So it sounds like there's a way that that you intentionally come into the space with your own personal connection and make that kind of transparent and known without censoring your own position within the story itself.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And something, a lot of things.
Tremendous feat. Yeah.
Some things are universal, right? I mean, when we get beyond some of the specificity, I mean, especially when we speak about trauma and trauma, there's traumatized landscapes all over the world. But I want to tell you a funny story if I can. So but I decided deliberately not to show my Brazil project, which is premiering at Catherine Clark Gallery in a few weeks from now. Just because it's a bit of it's a crazy project, and it's a bit too complicated to fully explain in such a short context as our talk today. But it's a perfect example of, in order to answer your question. So I was invited, I'd never been to Brazil. And I got an invitation from a Brazilian art foundation to come. And again, I had at least a 6-month lead time, maybe 9 months. And I was just sort of thinking, what do I want to do? And I was invited also, it was, the invitation was to go to Bahia, which is the most multi-ethnic, multiracial part of Brazil. 85% of the inhabitants are descendants from slaves. The slave trade was centered in Salvador, in Brazil. 4 million slaves went through there. And in any case, so I was thinking, and then, Trump and Bolsonaro, this kind of transnational nativism, racism, this horrible thing that was crossing borders all over the world. And then I was thinking about, and then Bahia is a center for Brazilian dance and martial arts. It's like a big part of cultural expression there. And then I went back to this crazy clip from a Mel Brooks film, a 14-second clip of, that doesn't matter. I hope the audience members in the Bay Area will go see the show. I don't have to get too specific, but it's a crazy idea. I was colliding Mel Brooks with Bahian dance and with fascism, sort of comedic representations of fascism. The point is, so here's my point. So I went there. How am I going to invite people to do this project with me, right? I'm like this. It's this. So I spoke to people, dancers and martial artists who I met, and I explained the idea. Fortunately for me, Bahia is the most progressive part of Brazil and the most anti-Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro, and so they could kind of tell where I was coming from, and they liked it, and they were immediately excited and on board. So that was just sort of one example. I mean, there are many other projects where the process is much longer and more complicated. Like a project I recently did with Syrian refugees in Europe. Again, I debated whether to show that today, but it's video, and video doesn't play very well on Zoom. And I was visiting refugee self-help groups in Europe, going up and trying to find participants who might be interested in doing this artwork. And that was also, that took a few months just of gaining trust and whatnot. I mean, it helped that my father's family came from Syria. That helped a little bit at the beginning.
There seems like there's a decent level of risk in terms of a lot of these projects as well, and not only the physical application of them, but the political implications of them as well, and especially in places that are constantly having shifting regimes or shifting. So that's very exciting, but also
right. Well, the number of times that I've been in front of people or groups of people where I'm sharing an idea for an artwork with them and inviting them in to participate. And where they're poker face, I have no idea what they're going to say at the end. And the number of times where I've done that and I've been very, very nervous to see if they like the idea or not, because if they don't like it, the project's not going to happen.
Right.
And usually they like it. And I'm like, I get very relieved. But anyway, it's just something I've done many, many times throughout my artistic life.
Yeah. There's a question already in the chat that I want to get to before asking more questions, but it says, Shimon, with less travel over this, and this is from Sarah Manika, over this COVID era, have you found yourself thinking or viewing your local environment with new eyes and or in different ways?
My local environment, I guess that merits an honest answer. I mean, I've been home a lot. So a lot more than usual. I think the pandemic, I think we've all sort of cultivated some kind of protective bubble around us somehow, where to try to, it's a tricky little dance we do, right? Where isolation doesn't become despair, hopefully, as it can easily. And so that's probably the best I can answer, because I relatively recently did a big project in New York. I don't feel like a huge creative juice to do another big project here these days. I've been thinking a lot about my project in Pennsylvania, my upcoming new piece, another really crazy project. And of course, my exhibition with Catherine Clark, and Night Watch in SF Bay. All of that's taken a lot of my energy preparing for that. So it's kind of interesting, because I am sort of diasporic, even in the way I just answered that, but it was an honest answer. Like I'm often thinking about then and there, or, not just where I am, but places where I will be or might be.
That's a really good segue into a question I have, just in terms of thinking about your work in its relationship to locale and location, and site specificity in a way that also engages history, and this way of presuming history to be, or at least being taught in a certain way, being taught that history is a static thing of the past, a thing that happened before that no longer, that is not active in a certain way. But obviously, as you explore in your work, and as we know, history is incredibly active and is constantly shifting and always unfolding. And so, especially under the auspices or the legacies of things like colonialism and genocide and slavery. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's like to work in these places that are both informed, that are both necessarily embroiled in kind of are weighed down in a certain way by historical legacies, but that are also active sites of contemporary crises like colonialism, or or I was just wondering if you could talk about what it's like to be working on the past in the present in these spaces that are always kind of in between.
Well, one thing for sure is to not create a work that attempts to make any kind of hegemonic statements or conclusions, right? And to maybe I like to create works in those situations that invite questions and don't necessarily answer them, and that are not pedagogic. They're not about transmitting information that we already know about, but instead that might allow us to experience familiar subject matter in new ways.
More effective ways?
Did you say effective?
Yeah. Affective.
Well, then we get it. Well, right. Well, then we get into the issue of what art can do that other disciplines don't do, right? So let's just say, I'll say like experiential, perhaps would be a shortcut, like way of a reductive kind of way of describing it. But going more to the core of your question, I try to be very, very mindful. And Dai's probably heard me say this before, but get very big ears. So situations that are contested, fraught, scarred, traumatized, I walk with I make as light a footprint as I can in engaging those communities. Now, ultimately, I'm an artist and I'm trying to make a good work of art. So there's always that sort of balance. That sometimes it's just the reality. Sometimes you're pushed against a wall and you have to decide, okay, well, am I gonna make a better work of art and maybe disappoint someone, or am I gonna not disappoint someone and then the art becomes a little, maybe less resonant or something? These are some of those choices that are sometimes most of the time they align, but sometimes they don't. And then you have a difficult decision you have to make. So I think though that, and I'm trying to give you a thoughtful answer because it's an important question. These are the things that I care about, right? I mean, life is really short. I'm not really into art that's about other art, for better or for worse, and I probably pay a price for that. You know, it's in the Jewish culture and history, we have that expression, tikkun olam, which literally from Hebrew, the literal translation is fixing the world or healing the world, making a better world, which might sound kind of corny, but I think we're all here for that. Most of us are here trying to do that in our own way. Mm-hmm. So the situations that you're describing that are complex, contested, raw, mm-hmm. and that are rife with traps, many easy traps that one can fall into. I think those are particular challenges that I'm interested in engaging. And I try to use all of my sensitivities to do so in a way that's respectful and puts the individuals themselves in the center. But again, it's a little bit of a tricky thing because sometimes, I am also the artistic director of the artist, so it's a dance back and forth.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit also about audience and how audience shifts shifts with your work. There's obviously the public activations, but then there's also things like gallery presentations of the work. And are there any tensions or challenges in sort of presenting this work in these different spaces, how it's received, how it's reacted upon? Do you feel that comes into the work?
It definitely comes into the work. It's something that, from the very beginning of my art making practice, I originally come from photography. That's what my MFA was in at San Francisco State. And yet I was making these ethereal temporary interventions in public places. And oftentimes I was photographing them if I felt the situation was photographic, whatever that means. Meaning if I felt that I could make an image that would have its own enduring power, and that could also be the art after the intervention was gone. And that part of my practice, that's what shows in galleries and museums, as well as my video pieces. And this is something that I've had so many discussions with curators about over the years, and no one has ever been able to convince me that it's either or. Mm-hmm. I'm somebody who feels that ideas can live in more than one form as long as they do so effectively in each. If you're doing like a mediocre photograph, that's not going to serve anybody or anything. So I make interventions, installations, then there's books that are published about those pieces or documentary films that are made. And then sometimes, if I'm fortunate, the photographs that result or even some of the video documentation might be able to stand on its own. The whole tradition out of conceptual art and made in order to be photographed, right? Mm-hmm. So the relationship between let's call it performance and image making. They're married, and my whole practice marries those different media together, which relates to your question because yes, the audience is different. Mm-hmm. Between someone who's stumbling upon a slide projection in a public place and somebody who sees a photograph of that in a museum, which by definition is more rarefied and it's more, it's kind of more aestheticized and more precious maybe, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm all into like a multiplicity of audiences and experiences as long as they are effective. If some really become low-hanging fruit and are not as successful, then they should not be taking place.
I want to shift, I guess, a little bit and talk about Night Watch. Very excited, obviously, to have this work being presented along the San Francisco Bay. One of the things I'm thinking about, though, is what makes San Francisco a significant site for Night Watch's activation. And part of the reason I ask this is because, obviously, like living here in the Bay Area and knowing that there are many overlapping histories of both migration and erasure in San Francisco. And it's something that's been interesting to me for a while, that San Francisco operates as a sanctuary city, but is also the site of rapid gentrification. And what do those things mean kind of together when people are actively being displaced, but it's also functioning as this, it's supposed to be functioning as this like open, welcome kind of environment. And so I was just wondering if any of those, how are you thinking about this work and its resonance within this site specifically, and whether or not any of those things kind of came into play?
No, all of those things came into play, and and then I get stuck. I sort of hit a wall, meaning that I'm from the Bay Area. I mean, that's where I formed as a young adult and a young artist. I mean, I lived there for 14 years till I was 33, and like New York, the Bay Area is has been a very multicultural place with a history of immigration and welcoming to outsiders and those most vulnerable, and has that history of being a progressive, welcoming place. But I'm just being very honest with you. I've also wondered about the issue of gentrification and displacement in terms of, how the Bay Area has changed since I left it in '91, and high tech and the amount of money in the Bay Area. And because I haven't lived there in a long time, even though I go back regularly, I don't want to, there's everyone in this call almost can speak better than I can to what those effects are. But I do indeed, I am aware of that tension between the progressive openness and what gentrification does to marginalized communities, which is basically push them out,
right?
Push them away. I don't know how to resolve it. I bump into a wall. And I think that's part of why I am so thrilled that Catherine Clark, and Clark, who's also on the call from Immersive Arts Alliance, they have had amazing support all across the Bay Area in a very short period of time to make Night Watch happen. It's not a small feat to produce a project like that. It's a really complicated and expensive and time-consuming project to pull off. And so I've mentioned that now only because that, in a way, that's a lovely aspect of the Bay Area, that they have found so much local support for the piece.
Yeah, it seems
that's saying something. So that's saying something. Right?
Yeah, of course. I think the exact tension and the wall that you've run up against, it sounds like that is probably where so much of the interest and the excitement around the project comes, is because I think we're all trying to figure out how to really how to work through these contradictions of, and the things that have been, I think, and I will speak for myself in terms of, being here over the course of the pandemic and seeing both amazing resilience and community connection between those of us who stayed, who didn't. There was a mass exodus of various tech workers, but for those of us who stayed on the ground, like you do see, there did seem to be a lot more connection that was kind of happening. But at the same time, so many of those disparities were also exacerbated by the pandemic, the unhoused making up such a large population of people being infected and dying, the people of color, large communities of color being the primary communities being hospitalized and dying from the, so it feels like no one really has an answer. Obviously, how can you have an answer to these things? And I don't presume that any one art piece can answer those kinds of questions at all. But it is, I do think there's something about the prescience of it, the timeliness of the work in the Bay now that I think some of the response is because people are also trying to, many of us are also grappling with these same questions all the time. And so it feels like, and so I guess that's another question I have. I suppose, you know, you were saying that you don't intend for your projects to be pedagogic or didactic in a certain way, but I'm wondering if you feel that this project, Night Watch here now in the Bay, what would you hope for viewers to take away from it or to glean from it? Or do you think it could be used in this way, not to instruct necessarily, but in this like cathartic space even? Like what is kind of what is a hope that you would have for the way people can engage with this work, or what it can do or mean at this particular time?
No, it's a great question, and it's always a question that I struggle with, because I'm like all of us, I'm sort of I'm my own complicated set of contradictions. Like on one hand, it's very easy. People will say, "Oh, Shimon, you're such a political artist," or you know, your work is about social justice, and all those things are absolutely true. But I'm not instrumental. I don't work in an instrumental way, meaning I'm not. I don't work in the sense of like, oh, if I do A, I hope B will happen. To the extent that I am, here's what it would be. That I would hope that first and foremost, that people have an experience in their own bodies of encountering these large faces floating on the water that just mirror back to us. We're looking at them, but they're also looking at us and seeing how we respond. And that there's that maybe we don't know as much as we thought we did about who these people are and what their experience is. And that's why I filmed them in such a kind of a neutral way. It's difficult because then we quickly get into the topic of, you know, what is the relationship between poetry and politics? Mm-hmm. And I'm an artist, so I do want there to be some poetry in a poetic experience where everything comes together: one's body, one's feelings, one's thoughts, one's questions, one's humanity. So maybe kind of a deepening of a shared common humanity would be, I'm sure that's one of my main goals. I hesitate articulating it like that because I'm an artist, and we don't, how artists are, we're funny bunches. We don't like to be reduced too much, but because for a very specific reason, because we want to keep maintain interpretive space. I don't want to dictate what someone's experience of the piece is on the shoreline. Maybe they don't go to a social justice place. Maybe they go to who is that person? Mm-hmm. And then that question lingers for them. And then maybe the next day in the newspaper, they read about who that person was, and they have further thoughts about it and reflect back to what they felt when they saw it. But again, ultimately, there's no denying, that tikkun olam, healing the world, is obviously, I think, a lot of why we're all here. Not all, but many of us. We want to make a better place, a more humane place. So that's probably enough said on that question.
Yeah, we can move on to the next one. There's a question in the Q&A, and please, everyone, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box. But this one is, as you mentioned, Shimon, this project is so expensive to produce. Do you expect to see change from people seeing the work? Have you seen philanthropy or even governmental agencies respond after witnessing your projects?
Well, I mean, I hate to say this, but the key time for them to respond is before the project opens, right? Because that's what enables. And I have been amazed, Catherine Clark has been the real genesis for this project happening. And I've been amazed by the support that she has gotten from the Wattis Foundation. I'm gonna screw up all the names. I'm not gonna, but there were some foundations and many Bay Area individuals. Katie, if you're there, you might add some stuff in the chat with some of the specifics. But you know, there are a number of progressive foundations that care about these issues, you know, the intersection of art, what arts can bring to the human and social dimension of our lives. And my project probably couldn't happen without that. I don't know what the percentage is with Night Watch. I think probably more than half of the money was from private individuals. I think so. Or in-kind contributions. But these are essential for the project's happening. I realize I'm answering the question in a different way than it was asked, because my experience is not so much like afterwards. It's more like what's more important for me is before. Is there a response and support before so that the project happens? I think that the whole idea of change and what changes society and what changes culture is such a big question, and I'm always kind of modest in that sense. I do believe I ultimately do believe in the power of the imagination, and artists, this is where we work, the imaginary. And then the question becomes, if you create a change in the imaginary, how does that filter out to the rest?
I mean, I think there's a real, I will just speak for myself. I think there's a real interest and urgency around, you know, I agree that I think so much of the real work is there being a response before the project even happens. Like that's really, that says a lot, but I don't know. I guess just thinking about this moment in time in particular, just given the last 2 weeks of another active refugee crisis in terms of refugees from Afghanistan, and hoping that if nothing else, that this kind of presentation, this very active conversation around human beings whose lives are being displaced or being lost does affect some kind of governmental change, it does touch someone with the power to do something about the situation. Right. I think that's something we always hope, not necessarily that any one singular work can do, but we hope that that art can have the capacity to facilitate at the very least.
Right. And of course, I have those hopes too. I don't like saying them out loud because, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
Something. Yeah.
So the next question comes in from Meredith Broberg, and it says, when you describe your process of collaborating with communities in developing a project, you said that this sometimes involves bringing them really crazy ideas. Could you tell us another story of one of these crazy ideas?
Oh God, no, you don't want to know. You don't want to know, trust me. Well, okay, so my piece that I mentioned, it's called The Crossing. It's also going to be on view at Catherine Clark Gallery. It's a single channel, 8-minute video this is the one that I made with 7 Syrian refugees in Europe who had recently crossed the Mediterranean on rafts. And they were lucky. They didn't drown. They arrived at their destination country, which was one of those small European microstates where the specific one doesn't really matter, but it's one of the microstates that has a history of gambling, like in the casino industry, and where some James Bond films were shot. And so I was thinking about all that in the same way I described about Brazil. In the months leading up to going to this place, I was thinking about these issues. And this was like 2 or 3 years ago when the Syrian refugee crisis was at its peak in Europe as an issue. And then I had this well, I call it a crazy idea. I use certain words in a kind of a colorful slapdash way, and maybe I should be more careful, but I thought it was crazy. I thought, well, what if, is there something about the casino roulette, the game of roulette, that speaks to the refugee experience in terms of the forces of life or death that are outside of one's control? So you're lucky or unlucky, you're able to leave your country, or you're disappeared by the army. You cross the Mediterranean, maybe you make it, maybe you drown, you get pushed back when you get to the border, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that was sort of a crazy idea. So I met with several Syrian refugees over a period of a few months. And I told them my idea. Does the game of casino roulette speak to you as a metaphor or a distillation for your life experience? And again, I was sort of petrified, like, how are they going to respond? And they said, Shimon, we love this. It exactly reflects our life. And we want to do this project with you. So that's another one. I mean, it could go on and on and on. I mean, Di Williams, who's there in the chat, that's another crazy project that I did, but we'll skip that.
I have another question. I have a question about, I guess, thinking about with Night Watch, how, many of the stories are specific, or many of the participants are specifically LGBT refugees or asylum seekers, asylees. And I was just wondering if you could talk about, and I feel like that's LGBT asylees are not necessarily are not the most visible of in terms of how the mainstream media portrays asylum seekers necessarily. I don't think we don't focus as prominently on those identities or those stories. And I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the specific challenges that you've experienced through doing this work, facing queer, trans, asylees, and what were some of the challenges of bringing those stories to the forefront?
No, it's a really, really good question, and it's complicated. I mean, I'm gay myself, which probably was helpful in some way, and it's very complicated. I'm sort of reflecting back to a conversation I had, for example, with a trans woman. And she felt I had unintentionally made her feel othered by simply asking her where she was from. And because I'm always curious about people's origins. It's just sort of part of my wiring. I'm curious about people's backgrounds and stuff. And I sort of took that on board and didn't ask anyone again about their origins. But it is a bit complicated. I'm being a little bit recalcitrant because I want to be very careful what I say. But I'll put it this way. I believe that LGBTQI asylum seekers have a greater support system than others in terms of in the United States. There's some amazing organizations in the US, like Immigration Equality, which is based in New York. And they have I don't know what it is now, but as of 2018, they had a 99% success rate.
Wow.
Can you believe that, of having asylum applications approved?
Incredible.
So it's sort of this it's complicated because then we get into issues of race and class. At least half of the people in Night Watch are people of color, maybe more than half. I haven't counted. So again, like sort of intersectional identity. I'm this, and I'm this, and I'm this, and I'm this. So I guess what I'm ultimately trying to say is, one thinks, oh yes, well, I'm doing a project with my own community or with, I have many different layers to my identity. So it could have been, I'm an Arab Jew, I'm this, I'm that, I have many things. But actually the issues, it's never that simple.
Right.
And there's traps one can fall into and challenges. The issue of LGBTQI asylum, when that community came more into the public consciousness was, of course, the caravans coming through Mexico, right? Mm-hmm. I think there were some of them that were, there was a lot of trans individuals, I believe in some of them, and then that would somehow come a bit into the news reporting on that topic. To go deeper with this involves it would require a deeper conversation in terms of like, all the different ways that we can be either annihilated or erased. Mm-hmm. Based on our sexual engine, the color of our skin, the amount of money we have in the bank. I mean, it goes on and on. And and what is the relationship between those different variables?
Right. I think it speaks to, but it does, that complication does still speak to kind of what I was mentioning before in terms of thinking, not even just specifically San Francisco, but even thinking about the US as the site of safety in certain ways for asylum seekers, LGBTQ trans asylum seekers, while also being a country that right now is battling all of this anti-trans legislation, like how to hold both of those things in one space. Similarly, in certain ways, similar with San Francisco as this place that has always been this haven, this safe haven for LGBT people, but then also thinking about the housing crisis and how that necessarily affects many. So I don't know. It's always this complicated. It's always both and. As opposed to either or, which is very interesting.
Right. And not to mention, of course, the Supreme Court decision that came down, was it today or yesterday, that basically prevents Biden from ending the stay in Mexico policy for asylum seekers. So it's just the gift that keeps on giving. It never stops.
Unfortunately. Another question that came through you kind of talked about this before, but I'm just for the purpose of reading this person's question. It says, I'm curious why you chose to have your subject stare blankly. Can you talk more about that decision and why you made it versus something more clearly obvious?
That's a great question. I'm so glad someone asked that. Yeah, there's different aspects to it. Well, again, there's this, I basically want to interrupt our projections onto people in different groups. So, oh, I feel sorry for you, or, oh, you must have had a hard life, or, oh, you're abject, or, oh, I'm scared of you. And therefore, I film individuals often with blank expressions that don't deliver any kind of emotional goods. That's just one reason. Another reason, especially with traumatized communities, is when we're traumatized, we sometimes, again, I have to be very careful about how I express things, but in some situations, in some contexts, there can be a sense of going into automatic pilot. We do what's necessary to survive. And it's never joyful. One never leaves one's home or homeland or community with joy or pleasure. And so I was also trying to speak, I sometimes try to speak also of that, the sense of that trauma partially makes us freeze, right? And not completely. And I think ultimately, I want the viewer to go away with questions. So by the participants holding back their interiority and become more like sort of foils for the viewer's projections, but they don't fulfill the projections. You know, yes, I have had a hard life, or feel sorry for me, or you know, when I've spoken with participants about this, because you know, we have many conversations exactly on this topic, and I see what time it is, so I know we have to wind down. But I speak with them about this, and they go, yes, they go, exactly. People think they know how we feel, and they don't. So anyway, that's my answer to that.
Well, thank you so much, Shimon. This has been a fantastic both glimpse into your work and your process, but also the conversation has been incredible. I'm so glad that we were able to do this, that we were able to partner. And I look forward to being in conversation with you again in September for one of the events around Night Watch's activation at Minnesota Street Project.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And I assume the links are in the chat. I haven't been looking, but
there are a million links in the chat. Okay, everything is there.
The show opens September 18th, and Night Watch is the 17th, 18th, and 19th. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Elena. Great questions.
Yeah, thank you, Shimon. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. Please, if you have any friends or anyone you know who wasn't able to make today's artist talk, we will upload this. We will upload the video to our YouTube channel later this week. So look out for that link. Yeah, and keep following MOAD for all of our incredible online programming. We look forward to having you here in person in October when we reopen to the public with brand new exhibitions. And we look forward to seeing everyone at all of the Night Watch events this September. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.